Elvis stopped mid-song, dropped his microphone, and rushed to the edge of the stage. 50,000 people held their breath. The king of rock and roll, in his glittering white jumpsuit, had just done something that would break every rule of show business and create one of the most touching moments in music history. But to understand why this moment changed everything, we need to go back to where it all began. It was August 12, 1977, at the Riverside Coliseum in Cincinnati. Just weeks before his death, Elvis was in the middle of what would become his final tour. The arena was packed wall-to-wall with devoted fans who had traveled from across the country to see their idol one more time. Among them was a man named Robert Carson, a 45-year-old factory worker from Toledo, Ohio, who had scraped together every dollar he had for a front-row ticket. Robert wasn't like the screaming teenagers or nostalgic adults who typically filled Elvis concerts. He was gaunt, his face hollowed by months of chemotherapy, his body weakened by late-stage lung cancer. The doctors had given him 3 months to live. That was 4 months ago. He had defied their timeline for one reason, to see Elvis Presley perform live, just once before he died. His daughter had tried to talk him out of making the 3-hour drive to Cincinnati. "Dad, you can barely make it up the stairs," she had pleaded. But Robert had been listening to Elvis since he was a teenager working double shifts at the steel mill. Through his divorce, through losing his job, through every hardship life had thrown at him, Elvis's voice had been his constant companion. Elvis emerged onto the stage that night with his usual commanding presence, but something was different. Those closest to him had noticed the weight he'd been carrying, the sleepless nights, the prescription medications, the growing distance from the world around him. Subscribe now because what happened next reveals a side of Elvis that few people ever witnessed, and the ending will leave you speechless. The concert began like any other Elvis show. The lights dimmed, the crowd erupted, and the opening chords of "C.C. Rider" filled the massive arena. Elvis moved with his characteristic swagger, his voice strong and clear despite the personal struggles that had been consuming him in private. For the first 45 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as fans expected. Robert Carson stood in the front row, tears streaming down his weathered face as he watched his hero perform. He had dreamed of this moment during countless nights in the hospital, through radiation treatments that left him barely able to stand, through the devastating conversations with doctors who spoke in terms of weeks rather than months. His wife, Martha, stood beside him, holding his arm to keep him steady. She watched her husband of 23 years experience pure joy for the first time in months, and she couldn't help but smile through her own tears. The man she had fallen in love with, the one who used to dance with her in their kitchen while Elvis records played on their old turntable, was present again, if only for these precious moments. Elvis launched into "Can't Help Myself," one of Robert's favorite songs. The factory worker began to mouth the words, his voice too weak to sing along audibly, but his lips moved with every lyric. It was then that something unprecedented happened. Robert, overcome by the emotion of the moment and perhaps feeling the effects of his medication, began to sway dangerously. His legs, weakened by months of treatment, started to give way. As he stumbled forward, his hand reached out instinctively toward the stage, toward Elvis, as if his idol could somehow save him from more than just his fall. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, but first, Elvis had to notice what was happening just 15 feet away from him. Elvis was in the middle of the song's bridge when he saw the commotion in the front row. His trained performer's eye, honed by thousands of concerts, immediately picked up on the distress. He saw Robert reaching out, saw the panic in Martha's eyes as she tried to steady her husband, saw the security guards beginning to move toward what they perceived as an overzealous fan trying to rush the stage. But Elvis saw something different. In Robert's eyes, he didn't see the crazed look of an obsessed fan or the calculated attempt of someone seeking attention. He saw desperation of a different kind, the raw, honest need of someone who was running out of time. The music continued behind him, the band unaware that their leader was about to make a decision that went against every rule of concert security and show business protocol. Elvis had performed through hecklers, through power outages, through his own exhaustion and pain. But he had never stopped a show for a single person in the audience. Until now. In the middle of the word "falling" in the song's chorus, Elvis's voice simply stopped. He lowered his microphone, and the sudden silence of his voice created a ripple effect that swept through the enormous venue like a wave. The band continued playing for a few more beats before they realized something was wrong and gradually stopped as well. 50,000 people fell silent in a matter of seconds, their collective breath held as they tried to understand what was happening. In the eerie quiet that followed, only the hum of the amplifiers and the sound of Robert's labored breathing could be heard in the front rows. Elvis walked to the edge of the stage, his famous jumpsuit catching the stage lights and throwing sparkles across the first few rows of stunned fans. He looked down at Robert, who was now leaning heavily against the stage barrier, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "Are you all right, sir?" Elvis asked, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's sound system. The question, spoken with genuine concern, seemed to hang in the air like a prayer. Robert looked up at his idol, the man whose voice had carried him through his darkest moments, and managed to whisper, "I just wanted to hear you sing one more time." But here's where this story takes an incredible turn. What Elvis did next defied every expectation and revealed the man behind the legend. Elvis knelt down on the stage, bringing himself as close to Robert as the barrier would allow. The distance between superstar and fan collapsed in that moment, replaced by something much more profound, one human being recognizing the pain of another. "What's your name, friend?" Elvis asked, his voice now gentle, intimate despite the thousands of people listening. "Robert," the man replied, his voice barely audible but somehow carried by the perfect acoustics of the venue. "Well, Robert, I'm going to sing something special just for you. But first, I want to give you something to take home." Elvis reached up and removed the silk scarf he was wearing around his neck, a signature piece that fans would literally fight for after his concerts. But instead of tossing it into the crowd as he usually did, he carefully handed it directly to Robert. "This is yours, Robert. And I want you to know that every time you listen to this next song, you remember that Elvis Presley sang it just for you." The arena remained perfectly silent as Elvis stood back up, adjusted his microphone, and began to speak to his band. "Boys, let's do," he touched me, slow and gentle. As the opening notes of the gospel song filled the arena, something magical happened. Elvis began to sing, but his eyes never left Robert. Every word, every note was directed toward this one man who had traveled so far, despite his condition, for this moment. But the truly incredible part was what happened next. As Elvis sang the first verse, other voices began to join in. First Martha, Robert's wife, adding her trembling soprano to Elvis's rich baritone. Then the people around them began to sing along. Row by row, section by section, the entire arena began to participate in what had become an impromptu congregation. 50,000 voices joined together in a song about faith, about healing, about the power of human connection. Elvis conducted this massive choir with gentle gestures, his eyes still focused on Robert, who was now openly weeping as he held the silk scarf against his chest. The song ended, but what happened in the aftermath created a moment that would haunt and inspire everyone who witnessed it. As the last notes faded away, the arena erupted in applause, not the screaming, frenetic applause typical of rock concerts, but something deeper, more reverent. It was the sound of 50,000 people who had just witnessed something sacred. Elvis remained at the edge of the stage for a moment longer, looking down at Robert with an expression of profound compassion. "God bless you, Robert," he said simply, before returning to his position center stage. But Robert Carson would never forget what happened next. As Elvis prepared to continue with his scheduled set, he paused and said to the microphone, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Sometimes, folks, the most important part of what we do isn't the singing or the dancing or the entertainment. Sometimes it's just about reminding each other that we're not alone in this world." The concert continued, but it had been transformed. The energy in the room had shifted from mere entertainment to something approaching spiritual experience. Elvis performed with renewed vigor, as if the interaction with Robert had recharged something essential within him. Robert Carson watched the rest of the show from his front row seat, clutching Elvis's scarf, his wife's arm around his shoulders. For those remaining 90 minutes, he forgot about his diagnosis, forgot about his pain, forgot about everything except the joy of being alive in that moment. After the concert, as the crowds filed out and the arena began to empty, Robert and Martha remained in their seats for a long time. They sat in the gradually dimming venue, processing what they had experienced. Robert carefully folded the silk scarf and placed it in his jacket pocket, next to his heart. The drive back to Toledo was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence that had characterized so many of their recent conversations about illness and mortality. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who had just shared something transcendent. Here's the part of the story that will stay with you long after this video ends. Robert Carson lived for 7 more months after that concert, more than double what his doctors had predicted. His oncologist couldn't explain the sudden improvement in his condition, the way his appetite returned, the renewed strength that allowed him to take walks with Martha again. Robert himself credited those extra months to what he called the Elvis effect. He carried the scarf with him everywhere, and whenever the pain became unbearable or the fear overwhelmed him, he would hold it and remember that night when Elvis Presley stopped his entire show just to acknowledge one person's struggle. More importantly, Robert used those 7 months to truly live. He took Martha on the honeymoon they had never been able to afford when they were young. He taught his grandson to fish. He recorded messages for his daughter to play at her future wedding. He wrote letters to old friends he had lost touch with over the years. When Robert finally passed away in March of 1978, just 7 months after Elvis himself had died, he was buried wearing that silk scarf. His family found dozens of Elvis records in his collection that he had purchased during those final months, each one a reminder of the night when his hero had sung directly to him. But the story doesn't end there. Martha Carson kept in touch with other Elvis fans who had been at that Cincinnati concert, and they began sharing their own stories of how witnessing that moment of compassion had affected their lives. Some became volunteer caregivers for terminal patients. Others started support groups for families dealing with serious illness. The security guard who had been moving to restrain Robert that night later said it was the moment that made him realize the difference between protecting celebrities from their fans and protecting the humanity in all of us. Even the other band members were changed by what they witnessed. Elvis's guitarist, James Burton, later said in interviews that it was the first time in years he had seen the old Elvis, the young man from Memphis who had always believed that music was about connecting with people, not just entertaining them. Subscribe, share this story, and leave a comment about how this touched you, because stories like this deserve to be remembered. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on Elvis himself. According to those closest to him, that night in Cincinnati marked a turning point in his final weeks. He began paying closer attention to individual faces in the crowd during his remaining concerts. He started dedicating songs to specific people he noticed in the audience, an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, a young woman attending her first Elvis show, a veteran in uniform. His personal assistant later revealed that Elvis had quietly arranged for flowers to be sent to Robert Carson's hospital room, though he never told anyone about it publicly. The card simply read, "Thank you for reminding me why I sing." EP. The silk scarf that Elvis gave Robert that night became a symbol within the Carson family. Martha would let their grandchildren hold it when they faced difficulties, a failed test, a broken heart, a moment when they felt invisible or forgotten. She would tell them about the night when the biggest star in the world stopped everything just to acknowledge their grandfather's pain, and how sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply see another person struggle and respond with kindness. Years later, when Martha was asked by a journalist what she thought made that moment so special, she said something profound: "Elvis could have sent security to move us away from the stage. He could have ignored Robert altogether. He could have continued with his show and no one would have blamed him. But instead, he chose to use his power, his fame, his influence, his platform, to lift up one suffering person. That's not just good entertainment. That's what it means to be truly human." The ripple effects of that single act of compassion continued to spread long after both Elvis and Robert had passed away. The story has been shared in churches as an example of unexpected ministry, in hospitals as a reminder to see patients as whole people rather than just medical cases, and in schools as a lesson about the power of individual kindness. Today, there's a small plaque in the lobby of the Riverside Coliseum in Cincinnati. It reads, "In memory of the night Elvis Presley reminded us that sometimes the greatest performances happen when we stop performing and start being human." Share this video if you believe in the power of compassion to change lives, and let us know in the comments how this story affected you.